In 2044, there's a caveat to working as a looper. Assuming the looper is still alive in 2074, he will be sent back in time to be killed by his younger self. Joseph works for a mafia company in Kansas City as a looper. Joe's boss, Abe, was sent back in time to manage the loopers and also owns a club where Joe frequents and spends time with Susie, a showgirl. Just handling the loopers would be boring, so Abe has also hired Muscle in the present day to help him run a criminal empire. These men are known as the Gap Men, led by a guy named Kid Blue. While at the club one evening, another looper announces that he has just closed his loop. The big payoff in gold is a reason to party. As Joe continues his work, he and the other loopers begin to notice that loops are being closed at an increasing pace. Things come to a head when one night, Seth, Joe's friend and a fellow looper, visits him in a panic, telling him that he failed to close his loop as he was expected to do. Seth claims that when his older self appeared, he was singing a song his mother had sung to him when he was a baby. Seth couldn't bring himself to kill him. But then old Seth told him that a new crime boss called the Rainmaker has commenced a reign of terror in the future and is now closing all the loops. Before Seth can reveal more, the Gap Men come knocking at Joe's door, forcing him to hide Seth in his apartment floor safe. The Gap Men suspect Joe is harboring Seth, so they take him into Abe. Abe makes a deal with Joe. If he gives up Seth, he will walk free. If he doesn't, they can't kill Joe because of how it could upset things in the future. But they can definitely make things difficult for him by taking half of the silver they know he's been saving up for his retirement in France. Joe immediately gives up Seth. Abe suggests Joe go to China instead of France. "I'm from the future. You should go to China." Joe is let go, and given a free lap dance with Susie, while Abe orders Kid Blue to call the doc so they can exact retribution on Seth. Elsewhere, old Seth attempts to climb a barbed wire fence, but notices old scars appearing on his arm, spelling out words telling him to go to an address. When he ignores this, his right pinky finger disappears. Shortly after, his ring and middle fingers disappear. The stubs are not bloody, as if the digits were removed many years earlier. Then the tip of his nose is cut off. Old Seth returns to his car and frantically drives to the address he was given. Just as he arrives, he loses his right foot, causing him to lose control of the car and crash. As he gets out and frantically limps towards the address, both of his legs disappear, and he falls to the ground and crawls the rest of the way to the door. He bangs on the door. Seconds later, Kid Blue opens the door and shoots him dead. As Kid Blue holsters his gun and carries the remains of old Seth inside, we can see young Seth, alive on an operating table where they were chopping off his body parts, and hooked up to a ventilator, which will keep him alive for the next 30 years. Joe continues to do killings. After each killing, he visits a diner and works on his French lessons. He is served by a waitress named Beatrix. While waiting to do one killing, he is puzzled when the victim is late. When the person does appear, he has no bag over his head and his hands aren't tied. To Joe's shock, it's his older self, and after a brief stare down, he tries to shoot him. He grabs a gold bar and throws it at young Joe, then knocks him out with a punch. When Joe regains consciousness, the sun is setting. He finds a note, telling him to get out of town. Instead, Joe returns to his apartment, where he finds the Gap Men searching it and removing his silver. He traps Kid Blue in his floor safe, but is winged by another Gap Man, falls from his fire escape and lands on a car parked below, falling unconscious. At this point, the movie pauses to show us the timeline that old Joe comes from. In this timeline, Joe closes his loop and moves to Shanghai per Abe's advice. Despite having saved up half his silver, Joe manages to blow through his funds within 10 years thanks to heavy drug usage and partying. By 2054, he's resorted to becoming a contract killer for local crime gangs. Over the 13 years that follow, his hair falls out, leaving him mostly bald. In 2067, he meets a beautiful, caring woman in the midst of a bar fight. She helps him get sober, and 2 years later, he marries her and settles down. Things are relatively peaceful for the next 3 years, until 2074. One morning, as the news are reporting on a terrorist attack by the Rainmaker, 3 armed men with wide-brimmed hats break into Joe's house, kidnap him, burn down his house, and take him to the time machine so they can send him back to close his loop. He manages to slip the zip ties they're using to restrain him, gets his hood off, and kills his attackers. He then jumps into the time machine. We see the previous events unfold, revealing that after knocking young Joe out, he stole his truck, hit up a drugstore for first aid supplies and clothing, then went to young Joe's apartment. He sees young Joe fall from the balcony. He promptly rescues him, killing the Gap Man who was shooting at young Joe, and disappears again. Old Joe looks up some cryptic numbers at the library, when letters begin to form on his right arm spelling out, Beatrix. It's a message from young Joe to meet him at the diner. They order identical meals. Old Joe asks Joe how his French lessons are going, then says in French, "I know you have a gun under the table pointed at me." When young Joe doesn't understand, old Joe says, "It's okay that you didn't get all that. You will. As old Joe says, he's glad he learned the language. Old Joe tells Joe more about the Rainmaker. He appeared out of nowhere, and single-handedly took control of all the major crime syndicates within 6 months. He's responsible for mass executions and vagrant purgings, and he ordered the closing of all loops. The syndicate men killed old Joe's wife by accident when old Joe was captured. Not too long before old Joe got sent back, old Dale gave him a numerical sequence that hints at finding the Rainmaker's identity. Old Joe knows that in Joe's present, the child who will grow up to become the Rainmaker is living in the same county. If old Joe can kill the Rainmaker, then he'll never be captured, and his wife would still be alive. The Rainmaker's practically a myth, and the only things known for certain are that he watched his mom get killed in front of him, and that he might have a synthetic jaw. They tussle when old Joe realizes that young Joe still plans to kill him. But it isn't long before both Joes notice that the diner has cleared out, and the staff and customers have disappeared as if anticipating an attack. Suddenly, GAT men burst in and ambush them. Under fire, old Joe gives Joe a piece of a map with an address marked and a string of digits, and tells him that the Rainmaker may live there. Young Joe and the GAT men shoot at old Joe as he runs off. Then the GAT men start shooting at young Joe, who also runs off. Young Joe manages to evade his pursuers, and follows the coordinates to a farmhouse owned by Sarah, who lives with her son Sid Harrington. When Joe shows Sarah the map, Sarah recognizes the digits as Sid's birthday and the serial number of the hospital where he was born, prompting young Joe to explain the situation about the Rainmaker. Sarah proves to know a lot about loopers and how they work. The database old Joe used with the string of digits produced 3 possible children born on the same day in the same hospital, and he is intent on killing them. Sarah warns Sid to stay away from Joe, but Sid is curious. He befriends Joe, and shows him some of the electronics gear he is playing with. Sid builds transmitters so Joe and Sarah can signal each other. Joe is very impressed with the advanced work the 5-year-old is doing. Old Joe tracks down one of the potential Rainmaker children heading to a birthday party. He kills him, but when he realizes he is still existing in his past, he breaks down crying. He has killed the wrong child. He then heads to the other child's place, but is hesitant when he realizes it's where Susie, his old flame from 30 years earlier, is living with her son. Instead of killing the child right away, he watches their apartment. As young Joe and Sarah become close, he learns that she is a TK with slightly more power than the other TKs, and that Sid was raised by Sarah's sister for 2 years until she was somehow killed. Sid thinks Sarah's sister was his mother, and does not believe that Sarah is his real mother. Sarah is shown to be frightened of Sid, running to her room and hiding in a safe when Sid gets angry at her in his belief that she's lying about being his mother. The next day, one of the GAT men, Jesse, comes looking for Joe. Sid helps him escape, and Jesse leaves. While Sid and Joe are alone hiding from Jesse, Joe tells him how his own mother gave him to the panhandlers, so that he grew up without her, a moment later saying that she sold him and that she used drugs. We see how being motherless led Joe to become a killer, a drug user, and in time, a looper. Jesse is suspicious of Sarah, and returns, holding Sarah at gunpoint when Joe comes down the stairs. As Joe tries to reason with Jesse, Sid starts to come down the stairs. Startled by Jesse, Sid falls down the stairs and goes into a rage. He lets out a massive telekinetic blast, killing Jesse. Jesse's blood rains out of his chest, implying how the Rainmaker's name was coined. Sid's extraordinary telekinetic abilities confirm to Joe that Sid is the Rainmaker, and that Sarah's sister was killed by Sid when he lost control of his powers. Joe finds Sid in the sugarcane fields, crying, and comforts him. Sarah helps Joe realize that this boy needs love, and may not turn into the Rainmaker if he is raised in a loving home. Meanwhile, Kid Blue has tracked down old Joe to Susie's apartment, and captures him when he breaks inside to kill the child. Old Joe breaks free, killing Abe and all the GAT men except for Kid Blue, who is shot in the foot. As the two Joes confront each other near Sarah's house, Kid Blue attacks and is killed by young Joe. Young Joe has been following after old Joe in his truck, which is knocked over by the TK blast. Sarah calms Sid, telling him repeatedly that she loves him and he'll be okay. Sid calms down and ends his TK storm. Sarah hugs Sid, and he calls her Mom for the first time, showing Joe that Sid can be controlled. Recovering, old Joe grabs his gun, ready to shoot Sid. Sarah sends Sid into the cane fields and uses her body as a shield, preventing old Joe from shooting. As old Joe prepares to fire, time flashes for young Joe, who realizes that the cycle of revenge is running in a loop. So he changes it. He promptly shoots himself with his blunderbuss, closing the loop circuit from his end. Sarah lovingly puts Sid to bed after bandaging up the cut on his face caused by old Joe's shot. Sarah then goes back out to the sugar field and notices that the ground around the overturned truck is strewn with gold bars, which old Joe looted from Abe's headquarters. She walks over to young Joe's body lying in the field, and takes a moment to stroke his hair, something that he had confided to Susie that his own mother used to do for him. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications to watch more videos like this.